There is a component on the back of nearly every commercial aircraft in the world called a jack screw. It is not glamorous, it does not involve computers, sophisticated electronics, or cutting-edge materials. It is a threaded metal rod, roughly the diameter of a large wrench handle, that turns inside a metal nut to move the horizontal stabilizer, the wing-shaped surface at the back of the aircraft that controls whether the nose pitches up or down. Without it, a pilot cannot control whether the aircraft climbs or dives. On the McDonnell Douglas MD 80 series, one of the most common commercial aircraft in American aviation through the 1980s and 1990s, this jack screw required lubrication. Not complicated lubrication, just grease applied to the threads at regular intervals so the metal surfaces didn't wear against each other. The grease fitting on the jack screw of Alaska Airlines N96. 3AS was found after the crash, plugged with dry residue. No lubricant at all was on any of the moving parts. The threads inside the acme nut, the component that held the jack screw in position, had worn down to almost nothing. And when those threads finally gave way, about 3 miles north of Anacapa Island, California, at 4:21 p.m. on January 31st, 2000, there was nothing left to keep the horizontal stabilizer from doing whatever the aerodynamic forces wanted it to do. 88 people died because of a maintenance shortcut that saved about 1 hour of labour. And the story of how that shortcut was allowed to happen and how a mechanic who tried to stop it was silenced is one of the most troubling in American aviation history. The aircraft and the airline Alaska in the 1990s. Visual note, Alaska Airlines MD 83 in its distinctive livery, Eskimo face on the tail. White fuselage, the Pacific Northwest setting. A regional carrier that had built its identity around being a friendly, reliable family airline serving Seattle and the West Coast. Alaska Airlines was not, in the 1990s, a carrier that most Americans associated with corner cutting. It was a Seattle-based regional airline that had spent decades building a reputation as the kind of company Pacific Northwesterners were proud of. It marketed itself explicitly as a family airline. Its pilots and ground crews were often described in terms that emphasized community and loyalty. Many of its employees flew Alaska when they traveled on personal time, which is a statement about how much the people who worked there trusted it. The MD-83 that would become N96 3AS, the aircraft that crashed on January 31st, 2000, was delivered to Alaska Airlines in 1992. The MD-83 was a variant of the long-running MD-80 series. Itself descended from the DC-9 that first flew in 1965. By the 1990s, the aircraft type was everywhere in American commercial aviation. Reliable, twin-engined, efficient on short to medium routes, the backbone of multiple US carriers. Alaska operated dozens of them. But during the late 1980s and into the 1990s, Alaska Airlines went through a period of cost pressure that affected how it managed maintenance. The airline was expanding, new routes, new aircraft, more passengers, and like most carriers in the deregulated post-1978 environment, it was looking for ways to reduce operating costs without reducing service. Maintenance is one of the largest variable costs in airline operations. And maintenance intervals, how often you perform specific tasks and specific components, are one of the places where airlines can, with FAA approval, adjust the schedule based on operational data. Between 1985 and 1996, Alaska Airlines progressively increased the intervals between jack screw lubrication and end plate checks, the inspection that measures how much wear has accumulated on the jack screw threads, 11 separate times. The original specification from McDonnell Douglas called for jack screw lubrication every 300 to 350 flight hours. By 1987, Alaska was lubricating it every 500 hours. By 1996, the interval had been changed to every 8 calendar months, roughly equivalent to 2,250 flight hours. By 1999, the end plate check interval had been stretched to 30 months, equivalent to approximately 9,550 flight hours, while the manufacturer recommended no more than 7,200 flight hours between checks. Each of these extensions was approved by the FAA. The approval process, as the NTSB would later document, was inadequate. The FAA inspector, who reviewed the 1996 lubrication interval extension, later told investigators that Alaska Airlines had presented only McDonnell Douglas's recently extended manufacturer interval as justification, without any supporting data specific to Alaska's own operational experience, maintenance practices, or the specific aircraft in their fleet. The NTSB found this approval inappropriate, noting that each airline operates under unique circumstances and that the FAA should require airlines to provide supporting data before approving interval extensions. Regardless of what the manufacturer has recommended for the general population of aircraft, Alaska Airlines also built its own non-standard tools for performing end plate checks. The devices used to measure how much wear had accumulated on the jack screw nut threads. When the NTSB examined these tools after the crash, They found that Alaska's fabricated restraining fixtures did not meet the manufacturer's requirements. Testing demonstrated that using the non-standard tools could produce inaccurate measurements, specifically measurements that would read less wear than actually existed. Alaska Airlines have been inspecting for jack screw wear with tools that systematically underestimated it. All of this, the extended intervals, the inadequate tools, the FAA approvals without supporting data, was in place years before N96. 3AS took off from Puerto Vallarta on January 31, 2000. Mechanic who knew John Leontine. Visual note: an airline maintenance hangar, Oakland International Airport, California, 1997. Aircraft on jacks, mechanics in coveralls working the overnight shift. The specific maintenance event that could have prevented the crash, playing out in a way that ensured it didn't. On September 26, 1997, N96, 3AS entered a C-check at Alaska Airlines maintenance facility in Oakland, California. A C-check is a major scheduled maintenance event, a thorough inspection that takes several days and addresses dozens of systems and components on the aircraft. Among the tasks during this C-check was an end plate check on the jack screw assembly of the horizontal stabilizer trim system. The day shift mechanic who performed that check was John Leontine. Leontine was, by the accounts of people who worked with him, someone who took his job seriously in an environment where taking it seriously was becoming harder to do. He performed the end plate check and measured a wear depth of exactly 1 millimeter, the limit specified by the manufacturer as a point beyond which the jack screw nut should be replaced. At 1 millimeter, the threads were at the edge of their service line. Leontine's judgment was clear. The jack screw nut needed to come out. He issued a work card ordering the replacement. When Leontine went home at the end of his shift, the night shift came in. The night shift supervisors, for reasons that were never fully explained, decided to run the end plate check again before accepting Leontine's measurement. They performed the test 5 more times and measured a wear depth of approximately 0.84 millimeters each time. On the basis of these measurements, the supervisors overruled Leontine's work order. The jack screw nut was not replaced. N96. 3AS was cleared to fly. The difference between 1.0 millimeters and 0.84 millimeters is 0.16 millimeters, roughly the thickness of 2 sheets of paper. The NTSB investigation found that the discrepancy between the day shift measurement and the night shift measurements was likely attributable to the non-standard restraining fixtures. The tools were producing inaccurately low readings. Leontine had probably been right. The jack screw nut was probably already at the replacement threshold in September 1997. But no one could prove it in that moment, and the supervisor's authority to overrule the work card meant the nut stayed in. By 1998, Leontine had had enough. He went to the FAA with a broader set of concerns. Not just the 1997 jack screw decision, but a pattern of maintenance record-keeping violations he had been observing for years. Supervisors signing off on work they weren't authorized to approve, records indicating that maintenance had been completed when it hadn't been. A culture in which the pressure to keep aircraft flying on schedule was consistently winning out over the discipline required to do maintenance correctly. For several months, Leontine secretly audio recorded his supervisors while gathering evidence. In December 1998, federal authorities raided an Alaska Airlines facility and seized maintenance records. A criminal investigation was underway. In August 1999, 5 months before the crash, Alaska Airlines put Leontine on indefinite paid leave. The airline publicly characterized him as a disgruntled employee with a personal grudge against supervisors who had passed him over for promotion. In the internal and media framing that followed, the narrative the airline pushed was that Leontine's complaints were motivated by personal resentment, not genuine safety concerns. In January 2000, N96, 3AS was still flying. The jack screw nut that Leontine had flagged in 1997 was still in the aircraft. Its threads had been wearing for more than 2 years since the last C-check. The next scheduled end plate check was not until March 2000. The flight, 31 minutes on the CVR, January 31st, 2000. A sunny Mexican resort city afternoon. Passengers boarding an Alaska Airlines MD-83 for the trip home to San Francisco and Seattle. Vacation luggage, sunburnt families, the ordinary end of an ordinary holiday. Mexico at 1:37 p.m. Pacific Standard Time on January 31st, 2000. The aircraft was heading to San Francisco with a continuing leg to Seattle. Aboard were 83 passengers and 5 crew members. 88 people total. The crew was experienced. Captain Ted Thompson, 53, was an Air Force veteran who had been flying for Alaska Airlines since 1981. 18 years. He had accumulated 17,750 flight hours, more than 4,000 of them as pilot in command in MD-80 series aircraft. First Officer William Bill Tansky, 57, was a Navy veteran 2 years from retirement who had accumulated 8,060 hours in the MD-80. Both men lived in the Los Angeles area and had been colleagues for years. 3 flight attendants, Kristen Mills, 26, Craig Polanco, and Allison Shanks, 33, completed the crew. Among the 83 passengers were Morris Thompson, 62, a prominent Alaska Native leader who had served as the first Alaska Native Commissioner of the Bureau of Indian Affairs and had spent 12 years as president of Doyon Limited, one of Alaska's largest native regional corporations. He was traveling with his wife Thelma, 56, and daughter Cheryl, 33. Tom Stockley, a longtime Seattle Times columnist, beloved for his writing about food and wine. Stacy Schuyler, a 20-year-old ground service agent for Horizon Air on her day off. At least 35 of the passengers and crew were connected to Alaska Airlines, or its regional partner Horizon Air, employees and their families, travelling on passes, trusting the airline they worked for. First Officer Tansky hand flew the aircraft to 6,000 feet, then engaged the autopilot for the climb to cruise altitude. Almost immediately, something was wrong. The autopilot was having difficulty maintaining the set speed and climb rate. Around 26,000 feet, the aircraft leveled off unexpectedly. The trim annunciator light illuminated. Tansky disengaged the autopilot and noticed that maintaining level flight required significantly more back pressure in the control column than it should. The aircraft was out of trim, and the trim system wasn't responding normally. The 2 pilots worked the problem. They attempted to run the horizontal stabilizer through its range of motion. They called Alaska Airlines maintenance in Seattle on a company radio frequency and conferred about what they were seeing. The maintenance base had no record of any known issue with this aircraft's trim system. The crew was professional, methodical, and calm. But they were also, without knowing it, flying an aircraft whose jack screw assembly had already partially failed. What had happened, the NTSB investigation would later determine, was that the last threads inside the acme nut had been shearing off incrementally throughout the flight. The jamming the crew was experiencing at altitude was caused by partial thread failure. The jack screw had locked up. When the crew later attempted to operate the trim system to troubleshoot the jam, that operation completed the thread failure. The jack screw pulled through the now threadless nut all the way to the bottom stop nut, a small retaining component that was never designed to bear flight loads. This caused the horizontal stabilizer to pivot sharply upward. The nose pitched down, the aircraft entered an uncommanded dive from 31,000 feet. Thompson and Tansky pulled out of that dive, recovering the aircraft to approximately 23,000 feet through extraordinary airmanship, using sheer force in the control column against a stabilizer that was now being held in position only by a stop nut it was destroying with every second of flight. The stop nut was not designed for this. It was failing as they flew. First Officer Thompson, note, the CVR transcript records that the first officer made the passenger announcement. Sources differ on exact speaker attribution for some transmissions. But this is the documented PA told the passengers over the intercom. Folks, we have had a flight control problem up front here. We have a jammed stabilizer and we're maintaining altitude with difficulty. Our intention is to land at Los Angeles. We have a jammed stabilizer. At one point during the conversation with ATC, the captain transmitted, "We are in a vertical dive." They were trying to reach Los Angeles. They had about 9 minutes. The final 9 minutes, and the question that haunts the investigation. The Santa Barbara Channel. Anacapa Island, visible in the background. Clear winter afternoon sky. The coast of California visible to the east. The last coordinates of N96. 3AS marked on a navigation chart. In the 9 minutes between recovering from the first dive and the fatal final failure, Thompson and Tansky made one decision that the NTSB would spend considerable time analysing. After recovering the aircraft to approximately 23,000 feet, while the stop nut was continuing to erode under the tail loads, the crew attempted to operate the trim system one more time. The NTSB's analysis concluded that this operation, running the trim in an attempt to relieve the back pressure they were fighting, completed the destruction of whatever remained of the acme nut's load-bearing capacity. The jack screw and its attached horizontal stabilizer were now free to move beyond aerodynamic limits. The stabilizer pivoted hard, the nose pitched over violently, the aircraft rolled inverted. Thompson and Tansky attempted to fly inverted, to maintain control in an attitude no commercial aircraft was designed to sustain. The CVR captured both men working the controls with complete professionalism and focus, coordinating actions, calling out parameters, doing everything possible with a configuration that had moved beyond what flight control inputs could address. Aviation writer Jeff Guzzetti, who led the NTSB systems group on the investigation and listened to the CVR in the agency's laboratory, described both pilots as sounding experienced, calm, and professional throughout. At 4:21 p.m, the aircraft impacted the Pacific Ocean approximately 2.7 miles north of Anacapa Island at a speed that left no possibility of survival. All 88 people aboard were killed instantly. The NTSB found that neither Thompson nor Tansky could have prevented the crash once the stabilizer failed. The board did note that troubleshooting an inoperative flight control, attempting to run a jammed system through its range of motion while in flight, may have accelerated the final failure. And they issued a specific recommendation that pilots be trained not to troubleshoot inoperative flight controls in the air, and that dispatch personnel and maintenance controllers be specifically trained not to suggest continued flight when a major control system malfunction is reported. But the board was unambiguous about who bore the responsibility for why the stabilizer failed. Both Thompson and Tansky were posthumously awarded the Airline Pilots Association Gold Medal for Heroism, the ALPA's highest honour. It was the first time the award had ever been given posthumously. Their names are on a scholarship fund and on the memorial sundial at Port Hueneme, California, that casts its shadow on a memorial plaque at precisely 4:22 p.m. every January 31st. What the jack screw told investigators, visual note, Navy divers recovering wreckage from the Pacific Ocean floor. The jack screw assembly being examined in the NTSB laboratory. The threads of the Acme nut wrapped around the screw like a slinky, stripped of all load-bearing geometry. The grease fitting plugged with dry residue. Evidence that told the entire story. The ocean floor recovery was extensive. Navy divers and remotely operated vehicles worked the wreckage field over multiple weeks, recovering major structural sections of N96, 3AS from depths of approximately 700 feet. The horizontal stabilizer assembly, the component that had caused the crash, was among the recovered pieces. NTSB investigator Jeff Guzzetti, leading the systems group, described examining the jack screw assembly when it arrived at the laboratory. The Acme nuts threads were stripped almost completely, thin, worn ridges barely visible where the load-bearing threads had been. The threads had unwound off the nut and wrapped around the jack screw itself, giving investigators a precise picture of the geometry of the failure. The grease fitting, the passage through which lubricant was supposed to reach the mating surfaces, was plugged with dry residue. There was no grease anywhere on the assembly's moving parts. The wear rate told an important story. The NTSB calculated that the Acme nut threads had been wearing at approximately 0.012 inches per 1,000 flight hours, 12 times the expected rate of 0.001 inches per 1,000 flight hours. At that rate of wear, the investigation concluded that the damage had not accumulated only since the last lubrication in September 1999. The wear was too extensive to have developed in just 4 months. More than just the last lubrication had been missed or inadequately performed. The San Francisco mechanic who had last lubricated the jack screw in September 1999 was interviewed by NTSB investigators. The interview established that the mechanic had spent approximately 1 hour on the task. McDonnell Douglas estimated the task properly performed should take 4 hours. The NTSB concluded that the September 1999 lubrication had been inadequate, and the investigation established that this pattern, inadequate lubrication performed too infrequently, had been occurring for long enough to accumulate the observed wear. A specific detail from the FAA's lessons learned database is worth noting. The Acme nut grease fitting passage, the small channel through which grease was supposed to flow to reach the threads, was found plugged with dry residue. If a mechanic applied grease to the fitting without verifying that it was actually reaching the threads, the motion of applying grease could be logged without the lubrication actually occurring. The NTSB suspected this may have contributed to the pattern of inadequate lubrication over multiple maintenance cycles. The investigation also examined the September 1997 C-check, the one where John Liotine had flagged the jack screw nut for replacement and been overruled. The NTSB found that if the accurate measurement at the time had been 1.0 millimeters of wear, as Liotine measured, the nut was at the replacement threshold and should have been replaced. Had it been replaced in September 1997, the jack screw assembly on N96, 3AS would have begun its next service life with a fresh nut, and the wear that ultimately caused the crash would have had to accumulate from zero, far from reaching failure by January 2000. The NTSB's probable cause was stated precisely: a loss of airplane pitch control resulting from the in-flight failure of the horizontal stabilizer trim system jack screw assembly's Acme nut threads. The thread failure was caused by excessive wear resulting from Alaska Airlines' insufficient lubrication of the jack screw assembly. Contributing factors included the extended lubrication interval and the FAA's approval of it, the extended end play check interval and the FAA's approval of it, and the absence of a fail-safe mechanism in the MD-83's jack screw design that could have prevented catastrophic pitch loss even if the Acme nut threads failed completely. The systemic failures. 4 parties, 1 crash. Visual note. A flowchart showing the 4 parties the NTSB identified as contributing to the crash: Alaska Airlines, McDonnell Douglas's Boeing, the FAA, and the specific maintenance decisions at Oakland, each connected to the central outcome by documented decisions and approvals. One of the things that makes Alaska 261 significant beyond the immediate tragedy is the NTSB's detailed attribution of responsibility across multiple parties simultaneously. This was not a case where one person made one mistake. It was a case where an entire system of oversight and accountability failed together. Alaska Airlines bore the primary responsibility. The airline had extended maintenance intervals without adequate supporting data. It had allowed a maintenance culture to develop in which the pressure to keep aircraft flying on schedule was overriding the discipline required to perform critical tasks correctly. It had used non-standard inspection tools that produced inaccurate measurements. And when John Leontine raised concerns about the specific aircraft that would crash and about broader maintenance record-keeping violations, the airline had put him on leave and characterized him publicly as a disgruntled employee. In December 2001, federal prosecutors announced they would not file criminal charges against Alaska Airlines. The airline settled all but one of the wrongful death lawsuits out of court. The total amount paid exceeded $300 million, covered by insurance. The FAA bore significant secondary responsibility. The NTSB's April 2000 special inspection of Alaska Airlines, conducted in the immediate aftermath of the crash, found widespread maintenance deficiencies that, in the NTSB's words, the FAA should have uncovered earlier. The investigation concluded that FAA surveillance of Alaska Airlines had been deficient for at least several years. The FAA's approval of 11 successive interval extensions without requiring supporting data was specifically criticized. The NTSB found that the FAA's oversight process for approving maintenance interval extensions was structurally inadequate. It allowed airlines to extend critical maintenance schedules on the basis of manufacturer recommendations alone, without independent analysis of the airline's specific operational data. McDonnell Douglas, by 2000 absorbed into Boeing through the 1997 merger, bore responsibility for a design deficiency. The jackscrew assembly on the MD 80 series had no fail-safe mechanism. In the language of aviation certification, a fail-safe design means that the failure of any single component does not immediately produce a catastrophic outcome. The jackscrew's Acme nut had a two-thread design that McDonnell Douglas had considered sufficient. The idea being that both threads would need to fail simultaneously for total control loss to occur. The NTSB found that this design did not provide meaningful redundancy with respect to wear, because wear affected both threads simultaneously. Total thread failure was a single-point failure mode that the design had not adequately protected against. The combination of these three parties, the airline cutting corners, the regulator not catching it, the manufacturer building in no mechanical backstop, produced the conditions for the crash of January 31st, 2000. Any one of these failures corrected earlier would have broken the chain. What Flight 261 changed in America? Visual note. FAA headquarters, Washington, D.C., the regulatory machinery responding, airworthiness directives being issued, Alaska Airlines mechanics receiving new training, the NTSB's 24 safety recommendations posted on the agency's website, each one a direct response to what killed 88 people. Together they represent one of the most comprehensive maintenance-focused reform packages the agency had produced in years, addressing failures at every level of the system the investigation had identified. The most immediate change was to the lubrication schedule itself. After the crash, the MD 80 family jackscrew lubrication interval was immediately changed to every 650 hours, a return to a frequency consistent with the aircraft manufacturer's original intent. The interval that Alaska Airlines had stretched to every 8 calendar months was cut to under a third of that. Every MD 80 series aircraft in the American fleet had its jackscrew lubrication schedule tightened overnight. The inspection tools problem was addressed through a requirement that any tools used for critical maintenance measurements conform to manufacturer specifications and be periodically verified for accuracy. The non-standard restraining fixtures that Alaska Airlines had been using and that had been producing the inaccurate low wear readings were immediately prohibited. The FAA's interval extension approval process was overhauled. The NTSB's recommendation that the FAA require airlines to provide supporting operational data before approving maintenance interval extensions, rather than simply accepting manufacturer recommendations as sufficient justification, became the standard. Airlines could no longer stretch critical maintenance schedules based on what the manufacturer had approved for the general fleet. They had to demonstrate, from their own operational data, that the extension was appropriate for their specific maintenance practices and aircraft utilization. An inspector's sign-off requirement was added for jackscrew lubrications, meaning that a second qualified person had to verify that the lubrication had actually been performed correctly, not just that the task card had been completed. The single-point failure problem in the jackscrew design prompted engineering review. NASA, recognizing that similar jackscrew assemblies were used in space shuttle hardware, developed engineering fixes including visual inspection protocols, electronic wear monitors, and a redesigned fail-safe jackscrew concept with a redundant follower nut. The NTSB also issued recommendations specifically addressing the cultural dimensions of the failure. Maintenance personnel and dispatchers were to be specifically trained not to suggest continuation of a flight experiencing a major malfunction. Pilots were to be instructed not to troubleshoot inoperative flight controls. These recommendations acknowledged that the pressure to keep the schedule alive, in the exact words captured on the CBR of Flight 2061, when the crew was briefly discussing the airline's preference for continuing to San Francisco, had influenced decisions in ways that contributed to the tragedy. A broader FAA review of maintenance interval approval practices across all US airlines followed. 9 major carriers were examined for compliance with critical component maintenance schedules. The Transportation Department's Inspector General reported that FAA inspectors were inadequately trained and that the agency needed structural reforms to its oversight program. In 2001, an FAA panel determined that Alaska Airlines had corrected the specific deficiencies identified, though the NTSB expressed reservations about the depth of those corrections. Alaska Airlines retired its last MD-80 aircraft in 2008, transitioning entirely to a Boeing 737 fleet. The maintenance culture the investigation had documented was, according to the airline, subsequently reformed. The criminal investigation that John Leotine had triggered in 1998 was ultimately closed without charges in December 2001. Leotine settled his libel lawsuit for $500,000, far less than the $20 million he had sought, and resigned as part of the settlement terms. 1832, John Leotine, the mechanic who was right. The work card from September 27, 1997, showing Leotine's measurement of 1.0 mm wear and his work order for replacement. The subsequent night shift notation overruling that order, a document that shows, in ink, the moment the crash became possible. There is something in the John Leotine story that stays with you after you've learned everything else about Flight 2061. In 1997, he performed a measurement, reached a conclusion, and issued a work order. The measurement was, in all probability, correct. The conclusion was right. The work order should have been followed. He was a mechanic doing his job the way it was supposed to be done in an environment that had slowly built a culture where doing it that way was increasingly inconvenient. He was overruled. The nuts stayed in the aircraft. A year later, fed up with watching the culture fail around him, he went to the FAA and started secretly recording his supervisors. The federal government raided the company and started a criminal investigation. And then the company put him on leave, spent months publicly suggesting he was a troubled, resentful employee, and eventually paid him $500,000 to go away. The criminal case was dropped. No one was charged. In January 2000, while Leotine was on paid leave waiting for his lawsuit to resolve, the jack screw nut he had flagged for replacement in 1997 failed in flight. He found out afterward that it was the same one. Admiral Cloudberg, writing about this crash, said, "The anger he must have felt is difficult to fathom." That seems correct. A whistleblower who triggered a federal investigation was retaliated against, lost his career at the airline, and watched the component he had flagged cause the deaths of 88 people, including 35 Alaska Airlines employees and their families, in the Pacific Ocean. Federal prosecutors declined to charge anyone. Alaska Airlines paid $300 million in insurance settlements, and the maintenance culture that Leotine had been trying to expose was reformed. Eventually, after the crash made it impossible to ignore. Aviation Plan logo. Hold. Then, the memorial sundial at Port Hueneme, California. A 20-foot structure with the names of 88 people on bronze plates around its perimeter. January 31st, 4:22 p.m. The shadow falls on the plaque. The Pacific Ocean visible in the background, calm and blue in the winter afternoon light. The NTSB's investigation produced 24 recommendations and reformed how American Airlines manage critical maintenance intervals and oversight. The lubrication schedule on the MD-80 fleet was fixed. The inspection tools problem was addressed. The FAA's approval process was overhauled. All of that happened after 88 people died. And the question I want to leave you with is this. A mechanic named John Leotine correctly identified the problem in 1997. He was overruled. He reported broader maintenance violations to the FAA in 1998. A criminal investigation was opened. By 1999, Leotine was on leave and being publicly discredited by the airline. The crash happened in January 2000. The system had the information, the system had the warning, the system had the whistleblower, and the system still produced the crash. Given the role that maintenance culture and FAA oversight played in Alaska 261, and given that we've seen similar patterns surface in other aviation and transportation contexts since, do you think the system built to protect airline passengers from maintenance failures is structurally better now? Or are there other John Leotines out there, in hangars at other airlines, with measurements that supervisors are overruling tonight? Leave your answer in the comments. And if you're following these stories every week, the crashes that changed how America flies, the subscribe button is right below this video.